Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much for coming. As Michelle's explained, I will be talking about the potential cost effectiveness of political interventions, mainly for animals. Oh, just a second. There we go. Thank you. So, most of us are here, I would hope all of us are here, because at some point in our lives, we realised the world was quite bad, and we wanted to do what we could to make it better. I think that's a fairly common intuition that most people have had at some point during their lives. What we've done, however, is actually quite uncommon, quite unusual, in that we've mainly focused on donating money to effective charities to help as many people as effectively as possible. That's quite strange. What's more normal, and what's the usual path for activists who are motivated to change things, is to go into politics. So the standard case for why activists go into politics goes something like this. The world is shaped by the way people interact with each other in small groups, in statewide groups, in international groups. Basically what my 17-year-old hippie sister calls society. She does have a point. Therefore, if we want to make the world better, we have to change society. Who's in charge of society? Well, perhaps the politicians we elect, who make the rules that govern us, the courts that implement and interpret those rules. Therefore, if we want to make a difference, we need to get political. We need to change who's in charge of the country and who's in charge of our laws. This is the basic argument. What I want to ask is this a sound argument? Before I do that properly, let's just very quickly remember there are loads and loads of other things we can do that are not at all political, that might be very, very effective. Non-political movements focused on individual behaviour change, for example, such as veganism, supporting research, funding new technologies, working with businesses. We need to be careful not to narrow down the range of things we assess too early. There are loads of great things we can do that are not political, and there are also loads of political things we can do that are really not great. So most political interventions will just be unsuccessful, and there's always a risk of backfiring. I realise e.g. communism looks a little bit harsh there. But, for example, things haven't always worked out as we planned. Having said that, I do want to make the case for politics. Someone once said, politics is show business for ugly people. I intend to fully rebut that, and in 3 stages. So first, I'll give a qualitative example of how politics can be very effective when you use your right to vote. Secondly, I'll go through some of the qualitative considerations that might make politics very effective. And thirdly, I will look at why politics might be especially effective when it comes to helping non-human animals. Okay, so voting. This is the example I'll be using to show that actually, if we calculate the value of a vote, it can be much greater than we thought. I am not a great voter. I don't think I even bothered to vote in my university elections because it felt like there were so many people. There were thousands of people. What possible difference could my vote make? I also didn't really care and hadn't found effectiveness at that point. But the idea, the psychological feeling that there are so many people who can vote, what possible difference could it make, is a very common one. It was outlined by Stephen Levitt in Free Economics. However, as effective altruists, as always, we have to think in terms of expected value. I think of expected value as the goodness of the thing you can get times the chance that you can get it. So, as Will McGaskill outlines in Doing Good Better, if the scope of the goodness you can get might be, say, $314 billion going towards public spending, if the party that you want wins, and if there is even 60 million people voting, on average, the chance that your vote will be the deciding vote is 1 in 60 million. You do the calculations, and the expected value of your vote is over $5,000. Now, I don't know how you value your time, but even I don't value my time at $5,000 an hour. So it seems that voting in these kind of things is actually extremely effective. And that's just a direct impact. As we'll talk about later, there's lots of other indirect ways in which voting can be effective. Now, that was just an example of a national election. If we want to get really, really effective, we should, of course, look at an election brought about by the Effective Altruism Foundation. So the facts are this. In Switzerland, great country, anybody can call a referendum on a proposal if they get enough signatures to do so. All the people in that city or canton or wherever it may be will then have the opportunity to vote. If a majority vote in favour, that will become part of binding law. So EAF has made a proposal that the city of Zurich spend 1% of its annual budget on funding highly effective charities. That 1% would equal about $90 million. We'll need 3,000 signatures in order to trigger the referendum, and the cost of this will be about $100,000. And the base rate for initiatives being accepted is around 11%. Now, we can argue either way whether this particular initiative would be more likely or less likely, but the base rate is a somewhat helpful figure. So somebody who's good at calculations, not myself, has calculated that this initiative, funding this initiative, is in expectation 300 times more cost effective than just donating directly to Give Well charities, which are, of course, already hugely more effective than most other charities. And those are just the direct benefits of voting. Even if we lose in this referendum, which is much more likely than not, there are a huge amount of other indirect benefits that we'll still obtain. So all 400,000 citizens of Zurich, a city with a significant number of wealthy people, a number of influential people, will receive in the mail our arguments in support of this referendum. On top of that, we will get media attention, local newspapers, national newspapers, potentially international newspapers. It's an opportunity to network with decision makers, leaders, politicians, and it's a way to bring in people who are interested in EA and grow the movement. So we get all of these benefits, even if we totally fail. If you're still not convinced, we can go through some of the common objections. So perhaps one could say, well, there is a risk that this initiative or other initiatives would go wrong. Maybe you take funding away from one place and it goes to another and it's all disastrous. Well, we can get around this by just asking for things that are very safe bets. Ending factory farming, for example. It's fairly difficult to see how this could backfire catastrophically. Other people might say, well, it's very unlikely we're going to succeed. And that's true. Maybe those people weren't listening to the part about expected value. But even that, 11% is not a negligible percentage. That's quite significant. A huge number of these initiatives have been accepted in the past. And there's a very, very high payoff for an 11% chance of success, affecting hundreds of millions of dollars or more of government spending. And then, of course, people could say, well, how do we really know the best way to measure up this kind of initiative against more direct giving? And it's true, these are really difficult questions. It's intrinsically hard to quantify the expected value, but we can do rough calculations like we've done before, and we can see there are lots of other arguments in favour of politics that make the initiatives worthwhile, even if they don't succeed. Okay, so having addressed the voting issue just as an example of how politics can be really effective, I'd like to talk about some of the more qualitative arguments. So if we look back to 100 years ago, everyone was in favour of the death penalty, pretty much. Nobody was in favour of gay marriage. And the question can arise, well, how did people change their mind? Because it's now pretty much the norm across society that those things are acceptable. Now, you might be tempted to think, well, everybody, sat down and reflected on the rational arguments for these things and collectively decided that this was better for everyone and therefore elected different politicians and therefore we have different laws, etc. But that's not actually how it works. Steven Pinker, in one of his lectures, relies on the concept of something called a norm cascade, which you may have heard of. The idea being that what usually happens is a few elites, a few important decision makers, influenced by rational arguments, come to the conclusion that a certain practice is just unconscionable and unfair, and then push through laws to make this illegal, and just push it through in the face of opposition. And everybody's very upset, and the media is very upset, and people are all riled up about this issue for a limited time. However, the law's in place, nothing drastic happens, it becomes part of the status quo, and people update their attitudes accordingly. And this has been seen throughout different social movements. So we can capitalise on that. Moral progress is driven by a few elites, not often the majority, and the majority will afterwards change their behaviour. Now, all the other benefits are really kind of offspring from that point. Politics is great for meme spreading, for movement building. You don't have to convince everybody, you just have to convince the right people, which is a lot more cost effective. Psychologically, people like to jump on a bandwagon. So if we do have an initiative that's successful, the ultimate would be if we had, a Facebook cover photo that everybody adopted, everyone else would be more likely to adopt it. And in that way, people can cheer for certain causes. And it's not very costly for them to share things on social media or to say that they have a view that all of their friends have, but that's how things become the norm. Also, politics is much less demanding on the individual. If I care about an issue, it's quite difficult for me to set out there by myself, campaigning, trying to change people's minds one by one. It's a lot easier for me to tick a yes in a ballot box if somebody makes that an option. So as you can see, there are excellent arguments in favour of politics that hold true even when we can't win individual initiatives at this stage. I'd now like to talk about, in this third section, why politics might be a particularly good strategy when it comes to helping non-human animals. Altruism, I think, if it means anything, means helping people who are suffering. And effective altruism, fair altruism, means doing so impartially. It means helping people no matter if they are close to us, far from us, if they have the same bodies as us, if they have different bodies to us. And it just so happens that non-human animals are the ones suffering in huge numbers. And if we care about helping, and if we care about reducing suffering, there's a very strong case to be made for focusing our efforts on non-human animals at this stage. The vast majority of suffering beings on this planet are non-human animals. We kill 70 billion land animals each year. We kill trillions of fishes. We don't even know the number of fishes we kill, but we do know that their lives are full of suffering and end with enormous amounts of suffering. Faced with this moral catastrophe, thus far, the main response has been to stop people consuming animals' bodies, has been to promote plant-based diets. And this is where much of the traditional advocacy has been, turning people vegan through steps from meat consumption to reducing meat consumption to vegetarianism to veganism. And these interventions are very effective. Animal charity evaluators has concluded that even 10 euros invested in leafleting saves around 250 animals. So if you compare this to the most effective human charities, as ranked by GiveWell, you can save around 30,000 more animals with your money if you choose ACE's interventions over GiveWell's, just as a comparator. So there's a lot of progress that's been made in stopping people eating animals and thereby reducing animal suffering. But focusing on individual consumption, focusing on dietary change might not be our best bet for a number of reasons. Firstly, just historically, trying to get people to change their individual behaviours, especially behaviours that they do 3 or 5 times a day, is really difficult. In the 19th century, the free produce movement, which tried to get people to boycott goods that were products of slavery, failed. Abolition was ultimately achieved through political means. And I think this resistance to changing what we do multiple times a day is really, really strong when it comes to the food we eat. If you go to somebody who is eating a hamburger and you want to engage with them on the philosophical case for anti-speciesism, it's very unlikely they're going to put down what they're eating and, have a proper talk with you about this. That's not going to happen because people, psychologically, we feel attacked and every bias in the book will come out. So food might be a very, very poor choice of battleground for that reason. Because if you ask most people in other contexts, do you care about animal cruelty? Do you care about the suffering of animals? They will say yes. If you ask them in the food context, everything gets very confused. It's very, very difficult to make rational progress when we're talking about food. Also, another problem with focusing on the consumption of animal products is that it risks being seen as a dietary fad, as something paleo or gluten-free or bio, or whatever it may be. And we need to be very clear that this is a movement about ethics, about reducing suffering, not about dietary change. So just to recap this, lots of people care about animals. They say they care about animals. They love companion animals that live with them. They don't want to harm animals. But food and telling people what to eat might not be the most effective outlet for that. Jonathan Haidt is typical here. He talks about the ethical arguments against eating animals. He visited a factory farm and said, "Since that day, I've been morally opposed to all forms of factory farming. Morally, but not behaviourally opposed." This is tragic. This is very sad, but this is the reality. This is the reality of human psychology that we're faced with and that we have to work with. And Haidt is not unusual. We hear those arguments time and time again. And that's why rates of veganism are so low in Western countries, despite a majority of people claiming to care about the suffering of animals. So to repeat, food is a dangerous area to engage with. And this doesn't mean we shouldn't engage with it at all. In fact, we most certainly should. But if we're going to be robust, we need to combine it with other strategies where people can have an outlet for their views that isn't quite so personally demanding. So I'll take you through a few examples of this. Sentience Politics has initiated a series of ballot initiatives in Basel, Zurich, Lucerne, most recently Berlin, demanding that all public cafeterias have a vegan option. A very moderate proposal. You only need a few thousand signatures, but the number of people it can affect are in the hundreds of thousands. In Lucerne, for example, we got all the signatures we needed in 48 hours. If you ask somebody, do you care about animals, would you sign this document, they're much more likely to say yes than if you ask them, do you care about animals, will you please stop eating that animal? There are obviously a number of indirect benefits. As we've spoken about before, we were featured in a documentary, and really through these initiatives, Sentience was able to establish itself as a serious political player in Switzerland, which is an important place to be established, given the rules surrounding referendums discussed earlier. Another ballot initiative is one being run in the city of Basel to give basic rights to primates, fundamental rights, the rights to bodily integrity, the right to freedom from torture. Now, of course, the number of animals that would be directly affected from this, if it were to pass, would be very, very small. But, again, this initiative provides a way for people to signal that they care about animals outside of the food context. We can also capitalise on very widespread opposition to animal testing. The debate is focused on speciesism, on animal rights. It's not focused on what people are eating. And it will be a hugely important anti-speciesist milestone, especially in a city such as Basel, where an enormous amount of animal testing does go on. Relatedly, the Nonhuman Rights Project is another example of a potentially highly effective legal intervention. So this is a judicial analogue to the case that's being brought in Basel and involves getting the courts to acknowledge non-human animals as legal persons. So Stephen Wise, the guy who's behind this, what he's asking for is a writ of habeas corpus, which is a very, very old writ in the common law and literally means show me the body. As in, if you are detaining somebody, you need to show cause for why they are being detained. The problem here is that somebody, you need to show that the person being detained is a person. And most of the litigation so far is focused around proving that apes are legal persons because they fit, the criteria that have already been established. This is great for a number of reasons. You need to persuade really not that many people. I mean, ultimately, you just need to persuade one judge. You create a historical precedent, and the way the legal system works is that once a precedent has been created at a certain level, the lower courts cannot undo that decision. In 1772, for example, the writ of habeas corpus was used in a case called James Somerset, which declared a slave to be a legal person and was instrumental in abolishing slavery in the UK. And again, there's really strong interaction and potential for movement building. In 10 or 20 years, fingers crossed, we will have our own judges and there won't be too many problems getting the writ, hopefully. Another example is the recent campaign by Sentience Politics to get a government-backed open letter supporting the development of cultured meat. Cultured meat simply being animal cells grown in a laboratory without necessitating animals being raised and killed and living short lives of suffering to obtain the meat. So what we're demanding there is state funding for cultured meat research. We are appealing to scientists, politicians, other influencers. And again, the debate can be focused on speciesism, on why animals matter, and why we shouldn't bring animals in the world to kill them and eat them, and rights. Again, this would be another really important legal milestone. And again, this would involve persuading very, very few people compared to the individual persuasion on a one-by-one basis that you need if you're going to turn everybody vegan. So, takeaways. Why is politics something we should be interested in? First, it's effective because you can reach a huge amount of people for a relatively little cost. If you look at the cost of bringing our initiatives, they are not staggering. And if you look at the media attention they've generated, it is huge. We can tailor our political initiatives to reach different groups of people at different times. So we can appeal to the masses with, for example, ballot initiatives, but at the same time, you can appeal to the elites with things like open letters or judicial interventions. Politics provides an opportunity to avoid the discussion around food and all the crazy biases we have around eating animals, and provides an outlet for people to express the fact that they care about animals without having to do a great deal. Also, avoiding food in general is good because we don't risk being linked to dietary movements, and we can focus the conversation on anti-speciesism and the prevention of suffering. Again, more broadly, we have reputation benefits for the EA movement if we can establish a position within the scientific, political, governmental community, and we can appeal to rational decision makers. We can hopefully follow one of those norm cascades which have led to other great social changes. And of course, an excellent thing about this is it doesn't close too many doors. It doesn't mean that we can't also reach out to businesses or also reach out to technologies or also continue to try and get people to adopt a plant-based diet. So, Sentience Politics is concerned with reducing suffering of all sentient beings. It's a very, very big ambit. And we're focused predominantly on non-human animals because that is where the volume of suffering is taking place at the moment. We're faced with a huge range of things we can do. We can turn people vegan. We can look for technological fixes in cultured meat. We can look for political fixes. There is a huge amount of uncertainty. But, as ever, in the face of uncertainty, you look for a robust approach. And politics does seem to be such an approach. It doesn't close any doors. Even if in the end we decide, actually, no, we've done some more research and we think getting people to go vegan is ultimately the most effective thing, political action is an effective way to make that happen. It's an effective way to make funding into technological research happen. It's an effective way to communicate with businesses. In particular, there's also the point that somebody should do politics. It's not really been tried in the animal advocacy movement to date. And we're at a stage where if we're going to push forward and make huge progress, we should be a little bit experimental. We should do it and see what happens, and we have good reason to think that it will be an effective thing to do. Just to close, here is how you you, my lovely audience, can help Sentience Politics put anti-speciesism into political practice. Please take a picture of this slide or talk to me or talk to someone, because we really, really would like your help on this. So the Berlin Ballot Initiative, which is to make sure there's vegan options in cafeterias, signature collection is starting next week. Please help us collect signatures. Get involved, email Stefan. We're also planning, longer term, a ballot initiative to put a ban on factory farming in the Swiss constitution. We're hiring campaign managers. If this is something that would be of interest to you or anyone you know, or you'd like to know more about it, drop us an email. Sentience is also spreading internationally. We're looking to spread the movement into India, China, Hong Kong, the US, the UK, Latin America. The globe is that list there. Our first step is to find country directors, and for those directors to produce overviews of the political, social, economic situation of that country, and to look for any kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of what we can do to get a presence there. So please email Max if you know anything or anyone that might be helpful there. Lawyers needed in the UK. As a lawyer in the UK, I can tell you it's really, really helpful to have something to do outside of corporate law. So drop me an email. Campaigners needed in the US. And finally, obviously, money needed. Having funds, having regular donations allows us to plan these long-term initiatives, which can sometimes take months, if not years. Only, 10 to 35,000 euros a year is one full-time person. So if you're able to fund a fraction of that, you are funding one person's full weekday to collect signatures, to do whatever it is we need to do to get political action going. So I hope you've taken a note of that. If you haven't, please come and talk to me. And I welcome your questions. Thank you.